Hi everyone, my name is Tom Lancaster. I'm the Threat Intelligence Lead at Volexity. And today I'm here to talk to you about a North Korean threat actor that we call SharpTongue. And it's about how they basically compromise experts, particularly in the field of foreign policy, through clever phishing techniques. So a lot of the talks at this conference are highly technical, and they're about the ins and outs of how malware works or like particular exploits. This talk does not touch on those things. Ironically, for a talk at a conference called Virus Bulletin, there is very little discussion of viruses. Instead, we're going to focus on the social engineering and the phishing that the attackers do to install the malware that ultimately is what they want to do. So a little bit of quick background about the company I work for, Volexity. You might be like, hey, how does Tom have access to so much cool stuff? And so to know that, you've got to understand a little bit about Volexity. The main reason you may know about the company is from a memory forensics perspective. So the people who wrote the volatility framework primarily work for Volexity now. We sell commercial solutions around that, Surge and Volcano. But we also do network security monitoring and threat intelligence, and the network security monitoring part of the business in particular has a reasonably good customer base in the United States, particularly in the NGO sector, so think tanks, places like that. And the stories I'm going to share with you, the examples I'm going to share with you today, come from our kind of monitoring of customer networks, engaging with customers in that space. But before we can get to the kind of interesting phishing techniques that the attackers are using, we've got to do some kind of legwork to get there. So we're going to talk a little bit about who the attackers are, what they want, and why they want it. Then we're going to talk about the social engineering and phishing techniques that the attackers use. And then there's a little bit about the infrastructure, some unique insights we have had in the past, in particular, into how the attackers manage that infrastructure. Some quick overview of the malware, and then some outlook and thoughts about what this kind of means for people who are targeted by this threat group. So who is SharpTongue? So SharpTongue, you may have realized that the agenda is not the same as what I'm going to use in the slides today, and that's because in the summer of 2023, my organization decided to change all of the threat actor names. And so you can basically ignore the difference between the two. They are the same. Do not worry. And we can now move on, satisfied that that issue is resolved. So they're a North Korean threat actor, active since around 2012. They use a swath of different malware. If you read the APT43 report, there's like 100 malware families listed. The most common ones that we see are listed there. They've got an innumerable number of aliases, just like every other threat actor that people talk about. But yeah, if you've read about any of these malware families or these threat actor names before, you'll have a rough idea of what I'm talking about. And for the particular stuff we're looking at today, I think it's interesting for any threat actor to think about what success looks like for them. And for this threat actor, success ultimately looks like access to a user's mailbox. Sometimes they'll go after other data on the user's machine, but predominantly what they want is the email, because the email is where people are sharing the most interesting information with their peers, particularly in kind of politics and the NGO space. And the way that they get access to a user's mailbox is through two kind of key things. One is credential theft. So that's I send you an email, and eventually maybe there's a phishing link, and that phishing link takes you to a login page for some service, whether it's like your actual work email, Gmail, whatever it might be. And then you enter your credentials, and hey-ho, the attacker has access. And that's becoming less common for this attacker as a way of doing things. Maybe because of the adoption of 2FA, maybe for other reasons. And the second kind of key way they could do this is through use of malware. So they can deploy any number of malware families, and they could use like a keylogger to steal all of the users' passwords. And they also have a very clever piece of malware that works within Google Chrome or any Chrome-based browser called SharpEXT, which steals the mail from the context of the user's browser. And the key outcomes for the attacker are basically they want insights into what the United States, some European Union countries, and South Korea are going to do regarding North Korea. So the types of people they're targeting and the information that those individuals hold is likely to be key in times of like negotiations and red lines. So the United States might say one thing in public about their particular stance on what North Korea might do in one scenario, but behind the scenes, the United States might actually have like a different red line. Like they say, if you cross this line, we'll punish you, but actually the red line might be much, much deeper. And the attackers are interested in knowing what the actual red line is, not the one you say. And the second unique outcome, or kind of thing that I don't think I really hear a lot of other people talk about, is that having stolen one user's mail data, they are very good at repurposing that mail data to phish other users. So by phishing one user, they gain great insight into what would make good phishing material or conversation material to attack a different user. And to really kind of hammer home the publications you might have read about the same type of thing, there are a number of those in the public domain. So from Google, Mandiant, I think the Huntress article on the left-hand side there is actually a really good example of what you'll find if you find a user who's been compromised this group. So yeah, I think there's a lot of previous reporting you can get your hands on. Sometimes we're able to gain insights into the types of target the group have, not just within our own customer base, but outside of our customer base. And the data in this slide and the next one comes from just one wave of emails, but we think it's relatively representative of the types of targets that this group is attacking. So you can see predominantly it's kind of think tanks, NGOs on the left-hand side. The next bar is education, so those are professors at universities who are essentially experts in North Korea. And there are various kind of journalists and government entities as well. And in terms of where those people live, a lot of them are in the United States. They're probably considered one of the key kind of influences in global politics regarding North Korea. And then there's obviously South Korea, which is probably also a very key issue for the North Koreans. And then a smattering of kind of countries around the world as well. One thing that's going to come up a couple times in this talk is the differential between targeting a user's personal webmail and their corporate accounts. So many of you in the room might think it's ludicrous that you would use your personal email to talk about work stuff. However, for a lot of the targets of these attacks, that is not the case. That is actually the status quo. So particularly if you're a person who is a professor at one university, you also hold a board position at another place, you end up having like 5 or 6 emails related to your work. And what you don't want is to log into 5 or 6 places. So what these professors and these other kind of professionals and experts do is they try to manage all of their email in one place, which is their personal email, and log into their work email as little as possible. And SharpTongue are very good at taking advantage of this. So once they figure out, like my work email might be tlancaster@volexity.com, but if they figure out that my personal email is like, I don't know, tlancaster@hotmail.com, they'll target that preferentially because ultimately that's where the best data is. So I said at the start of this talk that this talk is primarily about social engineering and phishing. And so that's what we're going to come on to now. And I think this is a topic worthy of discussion because Volexity tracks a number of different threat actors distributing like different malware. And some of those threat actors are very high sophistication, some of them are very low. And when it comes to social engineering, SharpTongue are relatively good. They're at the top end of the spectrum, I would say. Whereas other threat actors might have the best malware in the world, but if they can't convince the user to install it, or if they don't have an exploit, they're out of luck. And basically what it boils down to is that SharpTongue subvert a typical user workflow. So they have a real understanding of how the people they're targeting work on a day-to-day basis. And these people are typically, so a typical scenario for somebody who might be targeted is they might receive an email out of the blue. This is something that would happen to them every day. They'll receive an email out of the blue from a webmail account. And they'll say, hey, I'm a journalist working at this newspaper. I'd like to interview you on the subject of North Korea-China relations. And that is a normal thing to happen to them. And so the target might reply and say, oh, yeah, sure. I would love to do the interview. And then they might say, oh, I'm going to ask you these questions. And they send them the questions document, which is going to contain the questions that I'll ask you during the interview. And all of this is normal. And so the target is quite happy to open the email. And the attackers understand this. And the reason they understand this is because they have been doing this for a long time. They've read a lot of email between these people. And so they understand what the conversations look like. And they're able to take those conversations and basically replay them back to a different user and get success. And unlike a lot of attackers, the final point is that they're willing to spend time building a conversation. So if you ever talk to a user about what phishing looks like, you might often say, oh, you'll receive an email and it'll contain a suspicious link. But what you won't say is you'll talk to this person for a month, and then at the end of that month, they will send you a suspicious link. Nobody is taught to identify phishing that way. So in the top left of my diagram here, I've got the attacker, and in the top right, I've got the target. And this is just one example of how it might look. This isn't how it looks every time, and in some of the examples later, we'll have cases where the attackers didn't wait for so long. But this is something that can genuinely happen. So the attacker can send an email on day one, and it contains no malicious content whatsoever. It just says, hello, I'm looking to make a contact, and so on and so forth. The target replies, the attacker replies. This can go back and forth for a while. We can talk about different things. And then eventually, the hook is that they're going to send some phishing content. And the result is that the user either has to log into a service, which is a phishing page, or they have to open a file which contains malware. Those are the two kind of end games. But that might take a long time to get to. And what they've done very well is they've got these two kind of phishing principles that I think are kind of key to their operations. And I think a lot of attackers are very good at the second one. So I think in the previous slides, there was an example of like, you've got to respond to this RFQ. It's like you have to do this now. And so a lot of like commodity spam is very good at making people feel time pressured into responding to a phishing message. But what commodity phishers are less good at doing is making people feel comfortable about responding to that. And by engaging in that conversation first, the attackers are able to make people feel not only comfortable, but feel like they have to do it now. And so now I've got a series of examples of real-world phishing examples from this group that hopefully illustrate the points I've been trying to make. So we'll start with the simplest possible case, which is sharing a document. So the font's a little small, so I'll just kind of explain what's happening in the emails. On the left-hand side, the attacker sends an email to the target, and it says, hello, did you receive my email from 3 days ago? And the gotcha is that there was no email 3 days ago. This is just to see if the person is willing to reply. And then in the second case, in the second screenshot, the target has replied and said, no, I didn't receive your email. What was it about? And then they say, oh, sorry, here it is again. And they create an email that looks like it's being forwarded again. And it contains a link to OneDrive, which is hosting the malware file. And this is the kind of simplest ruse that the attackers will use. Stepping things up to be a little bit more, maybe you think, oh, that's kind of lame. That's not what he described. I think this is more along the lines of the type of thing you might have been expecting. So in this case, the attacker poses as a researcher at the KINU, which is the Korean Institute for National Unification, a Korean think tank that's focused on making sure or trying to make unification happen in Korea. And they say, hello, I would like you to submit to an upcoming conference. This is a real event that's happening. Please, could you give me an idea of the paper you'd like to submit and your abstract? And the target replies and says, hey, yeah, I'd like to submit, and so on. And they have a little bit of a conversation. And eventually, the target says, oh, what would you like me to submit about? What topics do you need covered? And the attacker says, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We'd like you to choose your paper's topic, but please review our guidelines and code of ethics. And they are, once again, hosted on OneDrive with a password this time. And generally, the password protecting the content on the OneDrive or whatever it is has become much more prevalent for the threat actor. And I figure that's because they were being kind of thwarted by attempts by Microsoft to detect their malware on OneDrive and other platforms. So now they simply password protect it, meaning the cloud providers are unable to easily detect their malware being hosted there. Possibly the best example I have is an example where the attacker proposes an in-real-life meetup between the attacker, the target, and a third party. So in this example, the attacker says, hello, I am a government official at the embassy of South Korea in Washington, D.C. And our target also lives in Washington, D.C., but does not know this person. And they say, I'd like you to organize a meeting. They're asking for an introduction because they know that our target knows another person who is visiting Washington, D.C. from South Korea. This is a relatively informed attacker here who wants to organize a fake in real life meeting between these three people and ask for a proposal of a date. They exchange a number of emails over a course of a week, maybe more, and they agree a time and a place for this in real life meeting to take place. And you might be wondering how they can convert this into a malware infection. And just one day before the meeting, the attackers say, oh, by the way, could you please, here's the list of the other people that will be attending the meeting. Please click on this Google Drive link. which actually I think the font's a little small, but it's not hosted on Google Drive at all. It's hosted on attacker infrastructure in this case. But in this case, the attacker has done something fairly outlandish. I could never have guessed that an attacker would ever try to organize an in-real-life meetup to facilitate a phish the day before. And by doing it the day before, they really make sure the attacker has to click it. I mean, the target has to click it that day because they need to know the information before the next day. And because there's no malicious content in any of the emails leading up to this, we only are able to kind of piece this back together on the final phish. So on the final day, we're able to find the phish, but then all the stuff coming before, we're completely blind to. Another example of a kind of technique that we've seen used more than once is asking people to write a paper. So in this case, the attacker says, hello, I'm a researcher at the Sejong Institute, which is a Korean think tank, and says, could you please write a 1,200-word piece for our website on China and North Korea relations? And they set them a deadline by which to do so. And because this is not an out-of-the-ordinary request, these experts are frequently asked to give opinion articles for various news outlets. And so that is exactly what the target does. The target spends a few hours writing a long-winded opinion piece about the current state of China and North Korea relations and sends it to the attacker. And the attacker says, thank you. Before publishing this on our website, I'd like you to review the comments I've made on your document. Could you please review them? And then once more, you guessed it, it's a OneDrive link. And the OneDrive link has a password, and within that is the malware. So to recap the kind of workflow that the attackers have here, they ask the user to do something they would usually do for work. They maybe engage them in a little bit of conversation beforehand. The user does that thing, and then the user gets something back from the attacker, and that thing is the malware. And essentially, often it's a document, but there are other formats used as well. But essentially, all that stands between the user being compromised and not is the enable content bar in Microsoft Word. So all the examples so far took place with real users, but in some cases, Volexity has been able to insert itself into the phishing conversation and try to get phished ourselves. So because of the kind of workflow that this attacker and some others use, if you identify the phish early on, it's kind of disappointing because you don't get any malware, which is maybe what you're interested in. And so in those cases, we will often ask the users who are targeted to actually follow along in the conversation and engage with the attacker until they actually give them the malware. But sometimes the users are not confident with that, and they don't want to talk to a hacker, is kind of the way they're thinking of it. And in those cases, sometimes we say, OK, well, if you don't want to talk to the hacker, perhaps you'd be willing to introduce them to us, and we'll create like some kind of fictional identity, either at the organization or on webmail. And that's what we've done here. And here we're talking to Melanie, who is the attacker. And Melanie says she works for NK News, which is a North Korean-specific news website. And we've been talking to Melanie for a while now. And eventually, she says there's kind of a security problem with the NK News accounts, which we've told her we have. And she says you need to register your IP to keep your account secure by visiting this link. And the curious thing here is that the link that she sent is to the real NK News website, but it's just a 404 because this page doesn't exist. So we kind of play along. We say, oh, Melanie, this link doesn't exist. And she says, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to make a mistake. Here's the real link. And then link number 2 is the one that phishes for your NK Pro credentials. Now, unfortunately, in this case, we don't actually have a subscription to NK News, so we cannot continue playing along. So we simply tell her that when we open up the page, it says that the page is malicious. Like, you know, that Chrome, this is an unsafe website page. And we say, oh, maybe you should scan your website. And Melanie says, don't worry about that. That's OK. Just send me your username and password, and I'll sort it out for you. So if all else fails, the attackers are perfectly happy just to ask for your username and password. And presumably, they do this on the basis that they've been successful with it at least once. In terms of infrastructure, there is kind of a broad summary that I can give you, which is that in the past, they often use compromised websites, particularly for the phishing campaigns I've described, whereas today, often they're using websites they've registered themselves. And I figure this is mainly around making their phishes look better so that the URLs that the users see, if they were to look at them, look close to real organizations. So those are some of the organizations that they kind of impersonated recently in the bottom right. So they're a mixture of US, Korean, and educational and news kind of organizations. But looking at that older cluster, we have kind of one interesting story to share, which is around C2 management. So I don't know how many of you work in the kind of, or how many of you have ever tried to tell somebody you do not know that their website is compromised, but generally it is a fruitless task because you will tell them that their website is compromised and they will assume that you are the one who did it somehow, and therefore they will not engage with you. But in 2019, we tried our luck, and we contacted a large range of compromised websites explaining that their websites were compromised and in use by attackers. Could we help you clean it up? And we struck gold. In one case, the website owner looked us up, figured out we were probably legitimate, and gave us root SSH access onto their web server. And we were able to basically do whatever we wanted for a period of around a month, and then we cleaned it up after that. And we notified everybody we could see was compromised through that particular compromised website. And there were a few interesting things we learned about the way the attackers did stuff on the C2 that are maybe worth sharing. So the first is around logging. So if you're a threat researcher and maybe you interact with C2s every so often, I think this is like an interesting thing about what even a relatively low technical skill threat actor is doing regarding logging of requests to their C2. So let's say it's a WordPress site and they've compromised somesite.com/WordPress content, and they'll have all of their files buried like 5 directories deep. And if you make a request to that root directory, they will just log your request, your IP, and your user agent and put it in a file. And what we would see them do is periodically they would review that file, copy lists of IPs from it, and add them to the ban list. And if your IP or user agent got added to the ban list, no matter what your request, you were given a 404. And so it was a way for the attackers to try and stop people monitoring their activity. And the second thing that I'm going to use in the slides, there's more detail in the paper, is around help.txt. So what the attackers would do is, because it's a compromised website, they would upload a zip file for every attack. So they were going to phish Virus Bulletin, for example. They would create a folder called VB. And in VB, they would dump vb.zip, they would unzip it, and then there would be all of the files that they were planning to use in that particular campaign. But the interesting aspect, at least in 2019, is that each zip file contained a file named help.txt. And help.txt explained to a user how they would use the different files and how they're all meant to link up. And to me, this strongly suggests that the malware author is not the operator, which is like an interesting thing to know in terms of this type of thing. There isn't a lot of time for malware talk. We're 25 minutes in, but we'll do a little bit. And so you might be wondering, what is the payload delivered? And more often than not, it is a variant of what is called the Baby Shark malware, which is documented by Palo Alto in 2019. And although it is given in kind of a name and description in that paper, in practice, the industry uses it to describe any malware that uses this function. So it's a VB script function that does an alphabet swap. And those scripts have varying functionality. Sometimes they perform some reconnaissance on the host. Sometimes they simply download and execute a file. They do it using different mechanisms. But generally speaking, it seems to me that the industry has settled on this decoding mechanism means Baby Shark, which is fine by me. And I think it's actually quite a clever piece of encoding in terms of how it does the work. So it's got that encoding function. It's got a big blob of text, and it executes the blob of text, which could contain anything. But I'm not really sure if there's any other attacker who is doing this particular type of encoding. So if you take the string hello world, I think it's worth explaining how it would work. It transposes it into a matrix, which can be of any size. But in this case, they chose the length of 3. And if you go down the columns, you can see it's spelling hello world. And then it simply joins the columns back up horizontally. And that's how you get the string on the right, which is the encoded text. And it performs the reverse operation the other way. And beyond that, what you get is quite a lot of different malware that is too much to describe in one talk. Suffice to say that when we investigated one compromised device in 2022, we found 5 different one-liner scripts, all of which was like completely different, which are aimed to download and execute some remote content, Miss Daisy, and then SharpEXT, which is the most important one from my point of view. So SharpEXT really helps them actually achieve their goal. So they want to steal mail data. And SharpEXT uses the unique position of being an installed browser extension to do that. And essentially what it means is when the user opens their browser and they have this malware installed, the extension will log into their Gmail as though it were in the browser. It will read all the email as though it was inside the browser and send it to the attacker. And so the key thing here is that one of the main things that stops these attacks from being successful is that the big webmail providers, whether it's Google, AOL, Microsoft, are looking for kind of erroneous patterns in terms of activity to users' mailboxes, and then they can alert those users about suspicious activity. But by doing it from within the context of the browser extension, the attackers are able to kind of just completely remove all that. Because from the big webmail provider's point of view, it just looks like the user is accessing their webmail from the correct IP, using the correct user agent. And so it's relatively good at avoiding that kind of detection. In terms of the outlook and what people can do to identify this, I have a couple of thoughts. So I think people talk about APTs, advanced persistent threats, but SharpTongue might not be so hot on the A, but they are very hot on the P. So they are very good at taking a target, figuring out who they talk to, who they already know, who they don't know, so they can figure out who to impersonate when they talk to that person. And they target those people again and again relentlessly. And maybe you think none of the examples I showed you in terms of phishing emails are like going to fool you. But if you receive 3 of those 3 times a week, or like you receive 3 emails a week like that for a whole year, eventually one of them is going to slip through the cracks, especially when you consider that this is quite close to a normal interaction for these people. And there are very few threat actors that we know about that take time to invest in a conversation before delivering any malware. Most threat actors are just happy to send the malware straight away or after 1 or 2 messages. There's only maybe, I can count on one hand the number of threat actors we track that would do 10, 12 messages before sending any malware. Targeting users' personal devices in email makes detection difficult. So a lot of the times we'll find an infection from this group amongst our customer base, and when we trace down the root cause, we'll figure out that the user used their personal webmail on their work laptop, and so we had no visibility of any of the emails. We just see the malware that ends up, and we have to retrace all of the phishing that took place before. And even more difficult on personal devices. So sometimes the entire activity takes place off network, but then the user comes in, uses the guest Wi-Fi in the work setting, and then gets picked up that way. And this makes it difficult not just for us, but for governments who are actually wishing to identify and notify users as well. So if you think about like NCSC in the UK, trying to notify various North Korea experts, that type of problem is also more difficult. And this is a real risk in sectors where personal use for device use for work is common. You might think it's like you think the user should change, but if you're working in security and you still think the user should change, I've got bad news. The users are not going to change. You just have to change your workflows to try and deal with it. And essentially, once a user is compromised, we relatively firmly believe that no automated solution will fix things. So most of the time, the users that get compromised have some AV installed, and maybe the AV detects 4 of the 7 malware families, which would be a not bad result. The problem is that there are still 3 malware families remaining. The next day, the attacker will just go and install 3 more and keep a very high number of malware families running concurrently, or running on like a schedule each day to download a new payload. And we think it's very unlikely that once infected, a machine will ever be truly made clean without human intervention, which is excellent from the attacker's point of view. And essentially, the only way that we've really been able to mitigate this is by working closely with users. So often the specific users that get targeted are targeted again and again, and we're able to build a relationship with them, explain what this looks like, make them feel comfortable reporting it, things like that. All right, that's all I have for today. Thank you for your time.